During World War I, the German sabotage network was vast. But how far did the conspiracy go? Did it climb all the way up to the upper echelons of the German Imperial High Command? Or was it a small band of saboteurs operating in secret on behalf of the Imperial government in an attempt to gain the upper hand during the war? All this and much more is revealed on A History of Bioweapons Part 4. Good evening, you're listening to the Truth Tank and I'm your host, The Tank. If this is your first time listening to the Truth Tank, a big welcome. If you're a repeat listener, welcome back. Tonight's episode has been several years in the making. This is part 4 of A History of Bioweapons. The third part came out a couple of years ago. I originally started this series, I think, back in 2021 or 2022 with The History of Bioweapons Part 1. It was supposed to be about a 3 or 4 part episode, and like everything, when I started to really dive deep into the research, I found out that it was probably going to be a hell of a lot longer than that. And it got pushed to the back burner a couple of years ago when I started researching live communism and getting really into that. I didn't have enough time to finish both, and I went down the communist rabbit hole pretty deeply. And My History of Bioweapons got pushed to the back burner, and that's where it stayed for several years. I also may have forgotten about it. It was always in the back of my mind that I hadn't finished it, and I wanted to get it finished, but it got lost on hard drives, and I've had several computers since I started it. I had saved it on my old computer, transferred it to a hard drive, and I spent about 2 months trying to find the original files because I'd written parts 1 to 3. But as it turned out, it was hiding in plain sight in front of me the entire time. I had looked previously on these hard drives. I didn't have any luck finding it, so I spent about a week, about 4 days, really scouring these hard drives to try and find it, which I eventually did. When I found the script for part 3 and realised where I was up to, I went deep down the rabbit hole, back into the very murky and disturbing world of bioweapons, and really tried to knuckle down and finish this very overdue series on bioweapons. I'm nearly finished. I'm up to the Soviet bioweapons program. That's around about the end of the bioweapons story. There's a little bit more to go and a couple of more modern things I need to add into it. But I've probably done about 80% of it. I've got about another 20% to go and it should be finished. I've written another, so far the script is about 75 pages. I've been writing this since the start of the year. I've had a couple of breaks here and there. I haven't written anything in a while. I've been too focused on recording the lie of communism. And it's been 3 years since I started A History of Bioweapons. So I've got these two epic stories that are set in the same time period. There's a lot of crossover, which is ironic because it took me 3 years to write the lie of communism. And it's been 3 years since I have done any research or writing on A History of Bioweapons. And both these series are set in the same time period and crossover. That wasn't deliberate. That is just purely by accident. That's just how it ended up turning out. Some events will be similar in both, but both series will interconnect with one another. The History of Bioweapons is kind of like a pseudo spin-off of The Lie of Communism. It's ironic when I think about it that these two epic podcasts I've spent multiple years working on, which have been the longest podcasts I've ever had to do in terms of research and writing, have crossed over and do connect, and that just panned out in a very unexpected and unplanned way. So I hope you all do enjoy it and get something out of it. Where we last left off in A History of Bioweapons Part 3, World War I was raging and the German sabotage network was running amok all throughout the United States, sabotaging factories and industry. That had a direct effect on the European war effort. The United States government was providing munitions and supplies to the Allies, mainly the British, in their fight against the Germans. But probably the most valuable resource the United States produced for the British and their allies were war horses, or horses that were destined for the front lines. There was many corrals throughout the country that would breed and train horses for the use in the army, which made them one of the biggest targets of the German sabotage network. The Germans tried to poison and infect the horses with a wide array of diseases, obviously to make them sick so they couldn't be used in the front lines. This kind of sabotage went under the radar for many years all throughout the US, mainly the East Coast. The German ambassador to the United States knew about the operation and had sanctioned it. Agents were operating out of the ports and recruiting sailors who were either German, of German background, or had some type of family connection back to Germany, or who flat out just didn't like the British Empire, such as a lot of Irish immigrants to the United States. They would recruit the sailors and dock workers into carrying out acts of sabotage on United States infrastructure. A History of Bioweapons Part 4 will pick up where Part 3 left off. We'll be going back in time, back to World War I, and pick up the story of the German sabotage plot from there. The pathogen of choice on tonight's episode is going to be none other than everyone's favourite, anthrax. So without further ado, let's get into tonight's episode. This is episode 87 of the Truth Tank. A History of Bioweapons Part 4, Rosen's Rebels, World War I, and the various sabotage plots. A History of Bioweapons, Part 4, The Fourth Von. Part 4 picks up where Part 3 left off, during World War I and the height of the German sabotage plot and accompanying network. This is the true tale of the Fourth Von to be involved in the German sabotage network during World War I. There are several characters called Von that appear in Part 3 of A History of Bioweapons, so if you don't know what I'm talking about or who I'm referring to, you'll have to go back and listen to parts 1 to 3 to get caught up. This Von was Otto von Rosen. Going back to part 1 of A History of Bioweapons, I'd mentioned this tale about German forces sending agents into Finland to try and infect reindeer with biological pathogens to sabotage war supplies destined for the front lines. In this case, the supplies were headed for Russian troops and most likely British and Allied forces as well. I did doubt the effectiveness of these attempts and questioned whether or not all that effort would have produced any results or been worth the time and effort involved to put agents in behind enemy lines into Finland. But as it turns out, this attempt was true. The Germans did in fact launch a sabotage campaign into Finland to try and affect reindeers. So this is the true tale of one such German agent, Otto von Rosen. By this point in the story, we know that the German sabotage network was vast, coordinated, and stretched right around the world. No nation was safe from this German sabotage network. They had the resources, the know-how, and the balls to pull it off. It was ambitious, sneaky, and brilliant in an evil way. They got around the restrictions of the 1907 Hague Conventions by targeting animals with biological agents instead of enemy soldiers, or an outright attack on a nation or a city. This is an obvious loophole the Germans exploited. They weren't launching or spreading biological weapons around cities or onto enemy soldiers, they were targeting animals. Like I said, sneaky and brilliant in a very evil way. I'm an animal lover and a big supporter of animal rights, and I don't condone any of the sabotage attempts on animals by the Germans. It's pretty disgusting when you think about it, especially in a modern context, but the past is the past and we can't change it. The objective was to hinder and or cripple enemy supply chains by sabotaging factories, supply depots, infecting animals with glanders, namely horses that were to be sent to the front lines. You probably get the picture. If you don't, parts 1 to 3 are available now, so go ahead and give them a listen and get yourself caught up. This is where our anti-hero comes into this true tale. Von Rosen, born Karl Otto Robert von Rosen, later to be named a lord, making his official office title as Lord Otto Karl Robert von Rosen. He was born in Sweden on the 11th of May 1884 in the small town of Solna. There isn't a huge amount known about Mr. Rosen. What is known and what I could find out about him is he joins the Swedish army, making the rank of lieutenant. This is my own personal theory. As I just mentioned, there isn't a huge extensive biography on Mr. Rosen, so I kind of have to theorize a bit and fill in the blanks. His early life and his army records weren't that detailed. It was only just a couple of dates and when he joined and when he got out and a couple of other milestones like that. Because this guy is not a well-known character in history. He doesn't really make too many history books besides his role in the German Sabotage network. I'm guessing he joins the army when he was a younger man, maybe around 18 to his early 20s, which would be around the 1900s. I'm also guessing this is where he learns to shoot and develops his shooting skills. I can't imagine there's a lot of rifle ranges or shooting clubs in Sweden in 1884. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm going to take a calculated theoretical guess and say his time in the army is where he learns his trade and sharpens his shooting skills. Because after that, he competes in various shooting competitions. He represents his country of Sweden in the 1908 Summer Olympics in London. If he was born in 1884 and he goes to the Summer Olympics in 1908, he would have been 24 years old. So say if he joins the army at age 18 or 19, serves 4, 5, maybe 6 years, I'll say probably more around the 4 to 5 year mark. That's plenty of time to learn how to shoot and develop those skills. If he already had them when he was a young boy, he might have been a hunter or something like that. We don't know. Rosen comes in 8th place in the Summer Olympics in the moving target small bore rifle event. They should really bring back the small bore rifle event because there's not too many moving target events in the Olympics anymore apart from the clay disc shooting. I don't think there's any events involving a rifle and a moving target anymore. I know the Winter Olympics has that cross-country skiing event thing where they go to ski, shoot, ski, and do a bunch of other weird things on skis. I have no idea what that's called, but yeah, bringing back a rifle event with a moving target would be pretty fucking interesting considering how many experienced snipers there are out there. And after all, like the past 20 years have pretty much been endless war, so there's a lot of people who had a lot of time to get good at shooting. Fast forward a few years and Lord Otto Karl Robert von Rosen, or as I'm going to call him, Lockrav. Rosen moves to Finland in 1912, which at the time was known as the Grand Duchy of Finland, as it was part of the Russian Empire. We will touch upon Finland again in the Live Communism and get a bit more of a background on the Russian Empire and its position during World War I and how it's all connected. The war arrives in Finland and Rosen gets caught up in the fast-growing resistance movement that was spreading throughout the country. A few years later, in 1916, Rosen has his own trading company. Unfortunately, there's not a huge amount of information indicating what year Rosen comes to own this trading company, except that he comes into possession of a trading company at some point. It's the same company where he establishes a covert connection with the German General Staff, as the Germans were at war with Russia, or at least the Tsar's troops and the Tsar's government, so maybe not the entirety of the country, which I'll explain in more detail in the Live Communism. But as the old saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Germans could help Rosen, and Rosen could help the Germans by conducting a microbiological warfare campaign against the Tsar's interests in Finland. Once trust had been established between the two parties, German agents gave Rosen explosives for sabotage and sugar cubes for hiding ampoules of Bacillus anthracis, better known as anthrax. The ampoules contained anthrax spores in liquid. Tell you what, you wouldn't want to accidentally drop one of them. An ampoule, if you don't know, is a sealed medical container, come in various sizes, usually made out of glass or plastic. They contain a biological sample or an antidote or vaccine or something like that. You break the top of it off so you know it hasn't been contaminated, hence why it's single use. Just Google it, probably makes more sense than me trying to explain it. One of the main pathogens I'll be talking about on this episode will be anthrax. So let's have a quick look at anthrax in all of its forms. So this information comes from the cdc.gov website. The article is called About Anthrax, published April 2nd, 2025. Key points: anthrax can cause severe illness in both people and animals. The bacteria that causes anthrax occurs naturally in soil worldwide. People usually get anthrax from infected animals or contaminated animal products. Call a healthcare provider immediately if you think you have been exposed to anthrax. I think that one goes without saying. People can breathe in anthrax spores, eat food or drink water contaminated with the spores, or get spores in a cut or scrape in the skin. Yeah, pretty nasty. Livestock and wild animals can become infected when they breathe in, eat or drink spores in contaminated soil, plants or water. These animals can include cattle, sheep, goats, antelope and deer. Anthrax is rare in the United States, however. Occasional outbreaks do happen in the wild and domesticated grazing animals such as cattle or deer. In the US, veterinarians recommend yearly vaccination of livestock in areas where animals have had anthrax in the past. The type of illness a person develops depends on how anthrax enters the body, through the skin, lungs, or gastrointestinal system. All types of anthrax can cause death if they're not treated with antibiotics. Interesting, I thought there would have been some type of special antidote for anthrax, but it seems like antibiotics will do. Cutaneous anthrax happens when anthrax spores get into a cut or a scrape on the skin when a person handles infected animals or contaminated animal products like wool, hides or hair. Yeah, interesting, it can last in the wool and hides. I did not know that. That's even scarier, I think, if it can live on animal products. Because how do you know if you went to a market overseas somewhere that the leather jacket or leather product you were buying, or a woolen jumper or a blanket or something, wasn't infected? It mostly shows up on the head, neck, forearms and hands. It's the most common form of anthrax infection. It is also considered to be the least dangerous. Inhalation anthrax can occur when a person breathes in anthrax spores. It's the deadliest form of the disease. People who work in places such as wool mills, slaughterhouses, and tanneries may breathe in the spores when working with infected animals or contaminated products. Inhalation anthrax starts primarily in the lymph nodes in the chest before spreading throughout the rest of the body. Nasty. Gastrointestinal anthrax can happen when a person eats raw or undercooked meat from an infected animal. It has rarely been reported in the US. It affects the upper gastrointestinal tract, throat and esophagus, stomach and intestines, causing a wide variety of symptoms. Welder's anthrax is a newly identified and rare disease that has been found in several people who are welders or metal workers. Interesting. This disease causes severe pneumonia and can be fatal. If you are a welder or metal worker and you develop fever and chills with sudden cough, chest pain, difficulty breathing or coughing up blood, see a healthcare provider immediately. Injection anthrax recently was identified in heroin-injecting drug users in Northern Europe. Also interesting. But it hasn't been reported in the US. Injection anthrax is similar to cutaneous anthrax and causes infection deep under the skin or in the muscle where the drug was injected. Pretty graphic pictures on this CDC site of cutaneous anthrax. Looks like someone's been burnt on the back of the hand by a cigar with some type of gigantic boil with a black center in it. It looks fucking disgusting. The symptoms of anthrax depend on the type of infection. Symptoms show up anywhere from 1 day to more than 2 months after you're exposed to the bacteria. If you don't get proper treatment, all types of anthrax have the potential to spread through the body and cause severe illness and or death. Symptoms include a group of itchy small blisters or bumps, large amounts of swelling around the sore, painless sore commonly on the face, neck, arms or hand that has a black center. Sore appears after the bumps have gone down for injection anthrax. Infected sores, abscesses deep under the skin or muscles at the injection site. Inhalation anthrax. Symptoms include fever and chills, heavy sweats, chest pain, cough, shortness of breath, confusion or dizziness, nausea, vomiting or stomach pains, and extreme tiredness. Gastrointestinal anthrax. Symptoms include fever and chills, swelling of the neck and glands, sore throat, hoarseness, and pain when swallowing, nausea, vomiting, especially bloody vomiting, lovely, diarrhea or bloody diarrhea, even lovelier, headache, red face and eyes, stomach pain and swelling, and fainting. Interesting and disgusting. Most people will never be exposed to anthrax. However, there are jobs, hobbies, and activities that can put some people at a higher risk of exposure. If someone has been exposed to the bacteria that causes anthrax, doctors may recommend anthrax vaccine, or they may recommend taking certain antibiotics to prevent anthrax from developing. And in the last couple of years, my opinion has really changed on vaccines. I've become a bit of an anti-vaxxer. I'm not 100% an anti-vaxxer because of things like this. There is a vaccine that can prevent very horrible diseases like anthrax. There's been a lot of debate I've been hearing lately about antibiotics and how good they might be and what they can do what they do to the good bacteria in the gut, but at the same time they can save people's lives. I had a massive blood infection a couple of years ago and would probably have been completely fucked if it wasn't for very powerful antibiotics. You're not meant to take them all the time, obviously, just when you need them. But without antibiotics and certain vaccines, a lot more people would lose their lives. I don't write anti-vaxxers off as just being quite conspiracy theorists because that's moronic. There's always some truth to everything. But I'm not 100% an anti-vaxxer either, so I'm kind of in this middle. But that's a very broad and controversial topic. Better saved for another day. If you have been exposed to anthrax, see a healthcare provider immediately and explain how you may have been exposed. It's important to get medical care as quickly as possible to have the best chances of a full recovery. Doctors can prescribe antibiotics to prevent you from getting sick. There are no tests to find out if you've been exposed to anthrax. Public health departments will have to do an investigation to see if and how you were exposed. Interesting, frightening, and disgusting. So back to Rosen. So Rosen assembles a small team to help carry out his mission. And once again, there's not a hell of a lot of information about Rosen's team or how he recruited them, who they were, where they came from, and how the connection was made with the Germans. There are a few details like that going forward that are a little mysterious and there's not a hell of a lot of info on them. I'll also be calling Rosen's team Rosen's Rebels from here on out. I thought that name was catchy. I liked it. So that's what I'm going to call them. That's my podcast too, so if you have a problem with that, you can fuck yourself. So the German agents sent the explosives and sugar cubes of death to Finland, where Rosen and his crew collected them to use for nefarious purposes. You also have to feel sorry for the postman or the courier. How would he feel about delivering sugar cubes of death and explosives if he knew about them? It seems a little dodgy too. I guess if it was a hotter country, travelling with explosives could be pretty dangerous. And obviously there's no biological scanners back then, so if you sent something in the post, I guess the courier services and the post probably naturally assumed that everything was above board and legal. I wonder how the mailman would have reacted if he knew he was carrying a dangerous biological pathogen. Rosen's rebels smuggled the explosives and sugar cubes disguised as canned meat. Yummy. By this time, Rosen had appeared on the Norwegian counterintelligence's radar. They begin to take note of what he and his rebels were up to. Norway was neutral during the war, so if the intelligence services took notice of Rosen and his rebels, they were definitely up to something sus. It also meant that if nothing was done about them, their actions could have much bigger implications for Norway. And I think it's pretty clear by this point he isn't just a simple importer or exporter of goods either. Norwegian counterintelligence suspicions were confirmed when they intercepted messages from Rosen, which described his transportation of mystery materials from Denmark to Sweden. Interesting. Once Rosen's crew had the goods, they set to work infiltrating Russian army bases camps and wherever else the enemy had a presence. Once a camp or a military base was infiltrated, the sabotage begun. I'm speculating here because, as I've mentioned already, there isn't a hell of a lot of information about what the rebels were up to. I don't think they would have written too many things down. Everything would have been kept under the radar and all the information pretty close. Some theorizing here of how the rebels might have gotten to the base. They would have had to have either dressed like Russian troops. They might have had to have passed some sort of security gate or checkpoint before making it into the main part of the camp or base. It's a pretty risky operation when you think about it. You're effectively behind enemy lines in an enemy camp. You'd also have to speak Russian, because I don't think going in there speaking Finnish would get you too far. I'm not too familiar with the Finnish accent, but I'm going to take a wild guess and say it probably doesn't sound anything like the Russian accent, which means if you were to infiltrate one of these camps, you would have to speak Russian or at least be able to pass as a Russian. I don't think it would have been an easy or stress-free job either. We've all seen this play out in the movies too, where a group tries to sneak into a covert base or something like that, and no one in the group can speak the language except for that one person, and they manage to bullshit their way past the guards, only to get found out later on. So once Rosen's rebels made their way into a base or a camp, they would head for the stables, where they would place the anthrax-laced sugar cubes of death in the animal feed of cattle and horses. Not too sure about the outcome of the sugar cubes, or how many animals died as a result of this sabotage. As I mentioned already, not a lot of records exist. I don't think they would have kept too many records, all being very public with the information, except for the basic facts we know. So yeah, not sure that it's worth all the effort trying to sneak into a heavily armed camp or base to try to poison the animals. But I guess in the eyes of the German Imperial High Command, it was probably worth trying anything to gain the upper hand in the war. As I just mentioned about a lack of information and not keeping records, Rosen was a very sneaky individual, and he covered his tracks very well. However, there are a few entries in his diary that make reference to his activities, specifically supplying rebels with anthrax in the northern areas of the country, which is very interesting. About a year later in 1917, Rosen makes his way to the city of Karisiok in Finnmark, Norway. He gets arrested by the authorities, who take his luggage, they go through it, and lo and behold, they find explosives, detailed maps of Finland and Russia, Rosen's diary, 2 boxes of anthrax sugar cubes, a gun, and bottles containing kawari, which is a plant-derived alkaloid poison used on arrowheads of all things. Interesting collection of possessions to take with you into another country, especially the last one. This kawari poison is used as a paralyzing agent in South American tribes for hunting, and it only works via the bloodstream. Which brings up the question, why did Rosen have it? And what was he planning on doing with it? A rifle, coins, camera, and vials of a mystery liquid were also found in his possession. So I'm not sure if he was arrested on his own, or if it was him and some of the rebels, or the rebels on their own. Some of his agents were arrested and they were interrogated by the authorities, which led to cargo being seized. Some of this cargo contained similar items carried by Rosen, namely explosives. However, the cargo wasn't obvious contraband at first inspection. It wasn't until later on that the explosive nature of the cargo came to light. And once again, information isn't very clear on whether the equipment confiscated by Rosen during his arrest was the same as the rebels. We don't know if the rebels were caught with exactly the same items as Rosen, vials of liquid, firearms, explosives, etc. But during the search of the cargo, items found do line up very suspiciously with the items carried by Rosen, and this includes explosives, a rifle, detailed maps, camera, pistol, vials of this mystery liquid, coins, 2 boxes of sugar cubes, and a diary. And this is where Rosen seems to get pinched. Was he just trying to import stuff into another country to set up shop in Finnmark? Was he moving the operation around the country? It's also unclear how the authorities came to suspect Rosen. So, what happens to Rosen? Does he go down for carrying explosives and dangerous items across borders. If he did this today, he'd be labelled a terrorist. Anything explosive in the modern day pretty much puts you on the terror watch list. Does he go down for carrying dangerous biological pathogens across borders with the intent to use them in sabotage? Well, not exactly. During the interrogation, Rosen's rebels convinced the cops that the cargo they were transporting was medical supplies destined for Finnish revolutionaries. What the fuck? Now, surely the police couldn't buy such a far-fetched story. Give that one a pass, because at the time I don't think the authorities were aware that it was a biological pathogen. There would have been no way to tell. There was no bioscanners. And they probably didn't have a microbiologist on staff with the technology available to test the samples to see if they were a dangerous biological pathogen like anthrax. I don't think that technology was around at that time. If it was, it would have taken a hell of a lot longer than a couple of days to test. So we can give the cops a pass on that, because they probably weren't fully aware of what was being carried. But the firearms, the suspicious liquid, and the explosives definitely does raise a few fucking questions, and really does bring into doubt the quote-unquote medical supply story destined for Finnish revolutionaries. The rebels eventually told the cops their mission was to poke the fires of anti-Russian sentiment within Finland and assist in its independence, which was later corroborated by Rosen, who confirms the mission was to assist these Finnish revolutionaries. The part both Rosen and his rebels leave out was the bit about using anthrax in order to do so. Rosen ends up spending a grand total of 21 days in the slammer, and fortunately for him, public opinion at the time favoured the Finnish revolutionaries, which aligns with his Finnish revolutionaries medical supply story. It appears from the outside looking in that he is trying to help or assist these Finnish revolutionaries in their quest for independence from the Russians. So this in turn causes Norwegian politicians to close and settle the case against Rosen as quickly as possible, leading to him being deported back to Sweden. Charges against the rebels are also dropped, and all parties want to forget it and move on. So Rosen and his rebels get a massive lucky break. But the true nature of Rosen and his rebels' mission doesn't come to light until they've already been released and are back in Sweden. The seized cargo was once again inspected by the authorities, and this time they went over it with a fine-tooth comb. And it wasn't until this time that the true and horrifying nature of it was really revealed. This included the little surprises that the sugar cubes were hiding. This alarms the authorities and the politicians in Norway and abroad. The Norwegian police open an investigation, leading them to look into the German Foreign Ministry. They start to put this story together. They've caught on that something isn't right, and that more than just quote-unquote medical supplies, cameras, and a rifle were being imported into the country. This leads to the police targeting a German envoy. They track down the envoy and seize his luggage, and in the process they break the diplomatic seals he was protected under. So in other words, this envoy has diplomatic immunity. And if you've seen Lethal Weapon 2, you'll get the joke in that. But on the other hand, the Norwegian authorities must have had reasonable intelligence to suggest that they were up to something, and that the Foreign Ministry office, just like in the United States, was the base of operations for this whole sabotage operation. They must have suspected that the Germans were up to something. Otherwise, I find it very hard to believe that they would break diplomatic immunity, especially given that a world war was raging throughout Europe, where Germany was the antagonist. And this could have made Norway a very big target of the Germans. They could have turned their attention on Norway next. I know there was a big conflict with Russia going at the same time. So this is a very delicate political situation that could have massive consequences for Norway if they fuck this up, or if they accuse Germany of any wrongdoing with it, without some evidence suggesting that they were behind it. And I'm sure the German Foreign Ministry in Norway had their own version of a Johan, and if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, you won't know who that is, which is another reason to go back and listen to parts 1 to 3. So a thorough search of the luggage revealed the police's worst fears. Large amounts of explosives and biological agents were found in the luggage, and I'm assuming they followed the envoy back to the German ministry, and this wasn't just his personal luggage. This is only theoretical because, as I mentioned before, there aren't a huge amount of records or information about some of these events. The police must have searched the German embassy because no one man could carry the amount of explosives and bioagents that were found. Despite a lack of information on Rosen's activities, there are a few pieces of evidence that remained. 2 of the sugar cubes that the police confiscated somehow end up in the Trondheim Police Museum. Now, these 2 unsuspecting sugar cubes sit in the police museum for around about 80 years. They just sit there silently, looking like normal sugar cubes. That wasn't until 1997 when they were rediscovered. The sugar cubes were sent to the Defense Evaluation Research Agency Chemical and Biological Defense Department, located in Portendown, UK, for analysis. While they were there being examined, fragments of anthrax spores were discovered inside the sugar cubes, hiding more or less in plain sight for all these years. The analysis done on the sugar cubes 80 years after the event confirmed the Norwegian authorities' suspicions that Rosen and his rebels were in fact waging a top-secret, state-sponsored, covert biological warfare campaign. Once again, not sure how effective this sabotage plot may have been, given the remote locations that these attempts took place in, and due to the secretive nature of it, there's not a hell of a lot of information from either side that confirms whether the sabotage attempts were effective or not. That concludes the true tale of Rosen and his rebels. Time to move on to more German sabotage and sabotage attempts. Another cunning and very disturbing plan involving biological sabotage from the immoral minds of the German Ministry of Defense was to contaminate Portuguese rivers with Vibrio cholera. For further clarification, I'm going to read the Wikipedia entry on Vibrio cholera. And this is from Wikipedia, obviously. Vibrio cholera is a species of gram-negative, facultative, anaerobe, and comma-shaped bacteria. The bacteria naturally live in brackish or salt water, where they attach themselves easily to chitin containing shells of crabs, shrimp, or other shellfish. Some strains of V. cholerae are pathogenic to humans and can cause a deadly disease called cholera, which can be derived from the consumption of undercooked or raw marine life species or drinking contaminated water. Now, fortunately, this plan was abandoned by the German High Command, but it doesn't change the fact that they were thinking about it and thought about it enough to think it was a viable option and even plan for it. This begs the question, why are the German military at the time so eager to resort to biological warfare and sabotage rather than looking to other avenues of warfare that don't rely on spreading dangerous biological pathogens? In saying that, however, other superpowers were looking into chemical warfare and did use it against the Germans, so it's the same thing in a way. The big difference is that history was written by the victors, which Imperial Germany was not. I guess the big difference with Imperial Germany is they seem to be obsessed with biological warfare. They have multiple plans in place to sabotage countries that don't even have anything to do with the war. I'm pretty sure Portugal was either neutral or had nothing to do with World War I. But yet they want to go poison Portuguese rivers. They seem to be very committed to biological sabotage and invest a lot of time and effort into doing so. They have networks all around the world. The German embassies seem to be the headquarters where these agents get their orders from, because no other nation goes to the level that the German Imperial High Command does. The Americans aren't doing this, the British aren't doing it, and yeah, there are some attempts from the Allies, but not on this scale. I guess the reason for that is they might have been focusing on chemical warfare rather than biological warfare because they viewed that as a better option. But then again, the Germans used chemical weapons against their enemies as well. But Germany was also the victim of chemical weapons, as Adolf Hitler can attest to. I'm pretty sure he was a runner in the German trenches or something like that, and he got hit with chemical weapons that had a massive effect on his overall health. I think he was blind in one eye for about 6 years. Hence why the Germans never used them in World War II. The world had banned chemical weapons pretty soon after World War I, I'm pretty sure. But biological weapons, on the other hand, seem to go under the radar. Is this just a simple case that they just weren't as effective? It was far easier and cheaper to produce chemical weapons that would have a obvious impact on the enemy as opposed to biological weapons, because a lot of time and effort and resources went into researching biological weapons with not a lot of results that really came out of any of the tests or sabotage attempts. Because if they were, I think history would probably be a little different. The German sabotage attempts don't quite seem to elicit the results the High Command were after. But that doesn't stop the Germans from trying. So another case of German sabotage involving animals was the planned sabotage of sheep in Romania. Sheep were to be exported from Romania to Russia, so German agents were sent to Romania to infect the sheep with Bacillus anthracis. However, things don't go according to plan. The bioagents were sent to German contacts in Bucharest on the 27th of August 1916, the same day as Romania declares war on Germany and Austria, and talk about poor timing. If it was the 26th or the 25th of August, things might have been different, and this might be a bit of a sign from God or God intervening in the war. What are the chances that dangerous biological pathogens arrive in Romania the same day as they declare war on Germany, the country that sent the pathogens in the first place? Talk about timing or irony. The biological material arrives at its destination, and it's hard to tell what the outcome was. And again, I couldn't really find a hell of a lot on this. It is meant to be a verified event, but I really couldn't find a hell of a lot of information on it at all. There is no Rosen or Rosen's rebels in this tale, so it's very hard to tell who is receiving these pathogens from German High Command, or what the plan was to infect the livestock. It's unclear how many agents were involved either. It's unclear if any of the agents are killed or captured along the way, or to what the exact series of events were. What we do know is the anthrax samples that were sent arrive in Romania and are buried in the gardens of the German mission. And I'm guessing this German mission is where the agents were operating out of, or it was the base of operations or a central meeting point for German agents. Were the German agents killed and buried with the pathogens, or is it just the pathogens that are buried on the grounds? Because it does seem a little coincidental that German pathogens are intercepted and buried on the grounds of this German mission. Now, I'm just theorizing again, but there would have had to have been some agents in play to receive the samples. It's probably a safe bet to say they were operating out of this German mission. At least there's some type of common national ground that is binding the agents to this location. I'm assuming some of them were either caught or captured, either receiving or going to use these pathogens, and that's where they were either killed or escaped. Who knows what actually happened? Because if the Romanians ended up burying the pathogens on the ground of the mission, it's a safe bet to assume that they knew what the Germans were up to, or at least there was enough information or suspicion that something dodgy was going on at this mission, and were either watching it or had an agent inside the sabotage network who was feeding information back to them. Maybe the Romanian authorities, like the Norwegian authorities, had caught on to the suspicious parcels that were being delivered to this one location. That seems probably likely as well. About a month later, the bioagents found in the gardens along with 50 bundles of TNT. The pathogens were later confirmed by Dr. Victor Babes from the Institute of Microbiology and Bacteriology as anthrax and B. malii. No idea if this was during 1916 or the modern day. I'm guessing these are samples from 1916 that were buried on the grounds of the German mission. The next year in 1917, the Germans were at it again, this time in France. The plan was to infect horses on the Western Front with B. malii via their food. The French had found vials of the bioagent and issued a warning to personnel in the area that something suspicious was going on. Investigations were carried out after the armistice, which revealed that the German council in Zurich had sent agents into Italy with parcels of cholera cultures, and I'm guessing they were to make their way into France to infect the horses, which is very sneaky and very deceptive, and it shows you how far and wide the sabotage network had spread. But it wasn't just French or American horses or Romanian sheep that the Germans had targeted. They had also declared war on horses, cattle and sheep in Argentina. And why Argentina? Because Argentina, like the US, was a major supplier to the British and Indian armies. And once again, like Rosen's rebels, the plan was to put sugar cubes of death in the livestock feed in the attempts to infect animals destined for the front lines of the war. The sugar cubes were transported, presumably from German waters, all the way to Argentina by way of submarine, which were then passed on to agents on the ground. And Argentina has a large German population, so this is not that far-fetched. The population was already sympathetic to the German cause. A lot of Nazis fled to Argentina after World War II, where they lived out the rest of their lives. There's even rumours that Adolf Hitler made his way to Argentina. A lot of the high-profile Nazis that made their way there did so by German U-boat. It was obviously undetectable at the time. There was no radar. There were no satellites that could pick up submarines. Even though Germany was under attack on all sides, they did have submarine bases in France and in Spain who were friendly to the Germans. The Spanish dictator Franco was BFFs with Adolf Hitler. They had visited each other. The Germans were welcome. In Spain, they were protected. A lot of high-profile Nazis fled to Spain in the final months of the war to escape, more or less. They'd make their way over to Spain, where they would be smuggled out of the country via U-boat. And I'm pretty sure Spain had one of the biggest U-boat pens or U-boat bases outside of Germany. It may have even been the biggest. France had another one, but I'm pretty sure Spain was one of the biggest and most important. And it wasn't attacked by the Allies because Spain was neutral, so you can't just go to attack a neutral country, otherwise that country gets involved. And pretty sure Spain was going through its own civil or revolutionary war, either before World War II or not too long afterward. I'm not too familiar with Spanish history, to be honest. I know there was a big German presence there at the time and that the U-boats were operating in the Spanish waters. So logistically, it's very feasible that a lot of high-profile Nazis that didn't want to be caught fled to Spain in order to make a very long trip from Spain down to Argentina. So unlike Rosen's sabotage attempts, this time around the effects of the sabotage were well known. About 200 mules died from the sugar cubes of death and can be attributed directly to the German sabotage network. Horses and cattle also died on transport ships en route from Argentina to Bordeaux in France. However, it's not known whether the horse and cattle deaths on the ships are directly related to the anthrax sugar cubes or just down to the stresses of the trip, such as dehydration, other diseases, malnutrition, etc. So we've just looked at the confirmed sabotage attempts. These are the attempts we know took place and were sanctioned by the German Imperial High Command. So now it's time for the unconfirmed reports. So these reports come from French sources and were taken after the war and can't be proven to be true, but they do make a good story nonetheless. So first up, allegedly a German agent tried to spread smallpox throughout St. Petersburg in 1915, followed in 1916 by the arrest of another agent with the same plan. This tale I call bullshit. There was too much happening in Russia when this was alleged to have happened. I think it would have been reported on. And given the amount of people on the streets back then during the rise of the Bolsheviks and the fall of the Tsar, I think a lot more people would have died if any type of bioagent was spread. A lot of these people were starving and probably weren't in the best of health, and all you needed would be a decent winter that would have exacerbated any type of biological pathogen being spread through a population. There were pretty large protests everywhere at the time, which would have made spreading the disease pretty easy. But it was also unnecessary given that Russian forces were retreating from the front lines and were being overpowered by the Germans. The Bolsheviks didn't support Russia in what they saw as the capitalist war. The Tsar wanted to keep Russian forces on the battlefield, and during the transition of power in 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks take power and pull Russian troops out of World War I. This is a pretty well documented period of history. As I just mentioned, it was the rise of communism and the fall of the Tsar, and there's absolutely no proof that this took place. Doesn't mean that it didn't. It could have happened. It might have happened on a small scale, but then again, if a couple of peasants dropped dead from a mysterious illness, I'm not sure it would have been reported on, because more history-defining things were happening in Russian society at the same time. Another plot involves infecting 4,500 mules in Iraq in 1917 with glanders, to which there is also no proof. I also call bullshit on this one. It's the end of the war, and this region didn't exactly have much to do with, besides maybe the production of supplies, and maybe the mules were destined for the Allied war effort. But as I said, this is right at the end of the war, so I'm not sure the Germans would have had the resources to try to infect 4,500 mules in Iraq. So what would be the point in wasting more resources and agents and money in a plan that's going to have no effect on the outcome of the war whatsoever? At that point, the war was pretty much won. Germany had lost. Seems completely pointless that they would waste the time and resources in an operation that would have no benefit and no outcome on an already lost war. So the next plot involves Colorado potato beetles. Apparently both the Germans and the Allies target each other's crops, and both use this innocent little Colorado potato beetle to do their dirty work. The beetles are known to destroy a large amount of crops, but once again, there's no proof to these claims. It's definitely interesting. It's an interesting story. I guess it also is a very unorthodox form of a bioweapon, and it's not the common application or definition of one either. Nowhere in the biological weapons rulebook does it specifically say a pathogen has to be a biological weapon. An animal or a insect, or any living creature for that matter, used in warfare is technically still a bioweapon. And speaking of animals as weapons, next up is everybody's favourite biological weapon, the humble rat. Apparently the British are told in October of 1917 by an unverified French source that the Germans, quote-unquote, the enemy had infected a large number of rats with plague and intend to release them in the UK via planes and submarines. Pretty fucking wild. And it wouldn't be the first time plague rats were used to spread disease and chaos, especially in times of war. Once again, like the other theories, there's nothing to back this up. And again, why? The war was pretty much over and would end in November of 1917. Maybe it's a last-ditch attempt to have an impact by the Germans, but how successful would it have been? By the time plans had been made and resources and agents and lots of plague rats had been gathered for this mission, the war pretty much would have been over. The next unconfirmed, morally questionable and wild report takes place in September of 1916. An intrepid officer of the German 21st Military Corps Division came up with a plan to fly or hover over English ports in Zeppelin airships for the purpose of dropping plague bombs. Not sure plague bombs would work or would be any more effective than plague rats, and this plan has a fair bit of luck behind it because you more or less are relying on not getting shot down before you get over your target, in this case a port, to drop the plague bombs. Fortunately, sanity prevails. The chief medical officer steps in and is quoted as saying, "If we take this step, we will no longer deserve to exist as a nation." Which is interesting because even though it's a morally questionable plan, it shows at least the chief medical officer was thinking of the moral cost of such an action and how Germany would be deserved to be treated in the aftermath of such an attack. And look at the damage done to Germany post-World War II. They crossed many lines and paid the ultimate price. And the same would be true if they had gone through with this plan. And that's all the attempts we know about. It's hard to determine if any of the above mentioned took place or they were just ideas. I got a feeling the last one is probably true. There is that quote from the chief medical officer. We don't know his name and there's not much to back up this quote. But that one to me anyway does seem more likely. It seems more practical to have a more or less a very primitive biological bomb. I'm not sure how effective Zeppelins were in World War I. I don't think they would have been. However, if I was to pick any of these plans to go through with, I think logistically this one is probably the easiest to pull off. It also brings up the question, where did these French contacts get the information from? Stands to reason it came from somewhere and it wasn't just made up. And there would have been enough to do at a time of war without having to worry about biological weapons on top of everything else that was going on. We know from the previous episodes that the Germans covered their tracks very well, and the details and extent of the German biological sabotage programs and networks weren't known in some cases until 20 years after the event. So it stands to reason that a lot of this information is probably coming out decades after the end of World War I, which does throw a lot of these attempts into doubt. The General Staff was also known to destroy any evidence linking them and the High Command to any type of biological weapons program. So it stands to reason that there would be large gaps in the information and what we do know about what did take place. Studies were done on the German sabotage network, and the results pointed the finger straight back at the German military academy in Berlin as being the prime suspects of producing glanders and anthrax for use during the war, which fits with what we know about the network and how they operated. Also, these pathogens are the same ones that are used in multiple sabotage attempts around the world. It's always the same two, glanders and anthrax. Another reason I don't buy smallpox use in St. Petersburg. The attacks and attempts on the US, Argentina, and Norway all used one of these pathogens, or both in some cases, which makes sense that a central lab in Berlin was behind it. It's far enough from the front lines to risk being attacked during the fighting. There would also need to be a steady supply chain of pathogens coming out of this lab to be distributed to the agents around the world, because without the pathogens, the whole plan is pretty much useless. The plan relies on the availability of the pathogens produced and the logistics of getting these pathogens in the hands of the agents. It does stand to reason that Berlin was the base of operations for pathogen production. A fair degree of sophistication would have also been needed to disguise the samples in food and equipment. Germany's development and use of these weapons during World War I sets up a very dangerous trend amongst its enemies like Russia, the United States, and the UK. After the war, they all start to research and develop their own biological weapons programs. If Germany was doing it and had used these weapons during the war, why shouldn't other nations? After all, biological weapons were effective if they could be applied right. They were also cheaper to research and produce than chemical weapons, and easier to hide and implement. But maybe one of the biggest incentives to start a biological weapons program is that they were hard to defend against. They were also invisible and much safer than chemical or nuclear weapons. The biggest developer of biological weapons was the Soviet Union, with the United States coming in second and the UK in third. Biological weapons during World War I weren't without their restrictions or limitations. The failure to success rate was pretty one-sided. A large amount of resources, personnel, and secrecy went into the sabotage network, supplying, smuggling, production of these weapons, not to mention the agents who had to do the dirty work on the ground. You have to pick people you can trust. If one agent snitched or was compromised, they could bring down the whole network. Being a saboteur also comes at great personal risk. You could be caught or killed on a mission, or you could simply just drop the vial of anthrax and infect yourself, or blow yourself up. One of the biggest disadvantages of biological weapons during World War II was weapons effectiveness. It was limited by the conditions that they were produced in. Dilger and his brother were making them in a basement lab, not exactly a state-of-the-art covert lab. Dilger's lab could have been exposed or shut down at any time. It could have also had a leak that would have ended up infecting Dilger and his brother, not to mention the entire neighborhood. It could have been raided by the police. He could have infected himself or one of his patients at the doctor's clinic. That was the cover for his whole operation, which would have exposed the sabotage network. The Germans, as we know by now, used a loophole in the Hague Conventions to get around using biological weapons targeting animals and not troops. It was a sneaky tactic, but also very risky. If this had been exposed, other nations could have done the same thing to Germany, and it seems like there is this moral boundary between some nations who are at war with Germany and the morality that Germany chooses to ignore in order to target animals and not troops. which does bring up the moral conundrum that comes with using such weapons, which is still a debate that goes on today. And you can apply this to any type of warfare, nuclear bombs, drones, electric warfare, robots, etc. They're all amoral forms of warfare and would bring about the mutual destruction of anyone using them. And that's one that's often associated with nuclear warfare, mutual destruction, which disturbingly enough has been in the news more than it should be. There were several factors that limited the use of biological weapons. One was fear of mutually assured destruction, and the other was open field testing, which was later redefined by the Soviets. It was lack of open field testing which really prevented these weapons from being much more effective than they were. In the field it was hit or miss, more so miss than hit. The idea of spreading diseases behind enemy lines seemed like a good one on paper. It seems like it should be pretty easy to implement. Poison a well, infect a couple of animals, and the diseases will spread. But the reality was much more different. A variety of factors come into play, such as the environment, heat and cold, potency of the samples used, the labs they were produced in, all played a part in the effectiveness of the weapons. In retrospect, it was a waste of time and resources. It didn't do enough to stop or hinder the enemy, and the records are scarce on the programs and their results. We can make a pretty educated guess that it wasn't effective enough to warrant any more resources. In other words, at the time, no one knew how the pathogens would behave outside of a lab setting. The real world was a completely different thing altogether. That was until Yakov Moisevich Fishman, one of the head Soviet scientists in charge of bioweapons research. He states that if a bioweapon program is to work and be successful in the field, there are 3 stages that are vital in its development, and they are lab, chamber, and open field. To get a better understanding of what this means, I'm going to read a section of an article I found on the National Library of Medicine, National Center of Biotechnology Information. This comes from their website. If any of the authors ever listen to this podcast, I do apologize for the pronunciation of your names. I'm probably going to get most of these wrong. The article is titled Instances of Biowarfare in World War I, 1914 to 1918, by Ioannis Nikolakakis, Spiro N. Markilos, George Panayotopoulos, Theodore G. Papawaniou, Marina Carmenou, edited by Alexander Marsevich and John R. Adler. Open field testing requires finding an isolated location that meets the technical objectives of the experiment and ensures secrecy and safety. Fishman mentions the mandatory start of experiments with either non-lethal or infectious bacteria to characterize a danger zone and to study the impacts and bacterial populations in the environment. The above methods and experimental equipment were acquired by the Germans post-war. Under a renewed program, the case studies, such as the limited contamination of supplies meant for enemy nations and the sporadic attempts to infect livestock via small-scale attacks, demonstrate these limitations. While these efforts indicate a capability to manufacture and deploy biological agents, the actual application was cautious and minimized, simulating mostly open field testing stages. Interesting. So World War II is over, Germany loses the war, despite its best efforts to undermine and sabotage its enemies. The use and results of biological weapons were mixed, as we have seen. I don't think they worked as well as intended, which I think is pretty obvious. The sabotage networks operating in the US were much more effective at hindering the war effort and wartime manufacturing than biological agents could have been, and much more cost-effective too. Maybe Germany should have put more resources into undermining US wartime manufacturing than into biological sabotage. I think that's pretty evident. It's a day and night difference in between what was successful and what wasn't. The destruction of Black Tom Island is a prime example of what a relatively simple and cheap sabotage operation can do with very limited resources and agents. All that was really needed in the sabotage of Black Tom Island was some TNT, cigar bombs, paying off a couple of security guards and a few dedicated agents. And the results were more than what German High Command was expecting. Thousands of tons of munitions were destroyed. that were destined for Allied forces on the battlefields of World War I. Those munitions weren't used against Germans, hence that's a win for Germany. The entire island was destroyed in the process, along with several ships. It wasn't just munitions that were destroyed either. The island itself was completely blown up in the process, as well as several ships. A major supply hub of wartime supplies was completely taken off the chessboard, meaning alternative supply hubs were needed. And I can't imagine there'd be too many businesses volunteering for that, given what had happened at Black Tom Island. Bioweapons, on the other hand, it needed a great deal more care to produce, source and transport, not to mention the great distances agents had to travel just to try to affect a few animals, which most of the time didn't end up resulting in any type of infection, and just made the animals either mildly sick. Yes, some deaths did occur, but not near enough to have any type of meaningful impact on the scale Germany had intended. Not to mention the safety of handling and transporting and smuggling such pathogens. And on top of that, there's the great personal risk faced by the agents travelling through enemy territory. The same can be said for the agents operating in the US. However, there were plenty of German dock workers, ships and diplomats already working and living in the United States, and they did have their own kind of mini enclave, this social structure which already had a well-established network. The US was also neutral at this time during the war, so it wasn't as dangerous as crossing the frozen tundras of Norway, like Rosen and his rebels. However, the German biological warfare program wasn't a complete waste. It did yield some results. Firstly, it was the first time that biological warfare had been undertaken on this type of scale at any point during history, and sets a new precedent for the history of biological warfare. Biological warfare in the early 19th century was on a massive, nearly industrialized scale. It was well financed and organized. Long gone were the days of mixing spider venom, dog shit, and rabbit saliva into a clay pot, throwing it over the city walls at your enemy, and hoping disease would spread throughout a population. This was biowarfare as the world had never seen it before. It also comes at a point in human history where our understanding and knowledge of how diseases and pathogens worked was vastly different from any other point in history. The Romans didn't have a clear understanding of how bacteria worked, as smart as they were. Medieval Europe had some idea of bacteria. They knew probably what germs were to a point. They knew they could use them in warfare. They obviously knew what diseases were. If you had a rotting body and you catapulted that into a city, people would get sick. Same goes for poisoning water supplies. They knew about the plague. People got sick and died from it. Hence, if you could take a body of a plague victim, you could infect other people with it. And you could also use that as a very primitive, disgusting form of biological warfare. You'd catapult the body over a city wall and spread disease. They probably didn't quite know what was causing the sickness, but they did know how to manipulate it. And when you do think about how backwards people were in the medieval day, it's kind of amazing that anyone actually lived through it. There wasn't a very high level of cleanliness either, so people weren't washing their hands regularly. They also had some very weird religious ideas of how diseases were spread. Not to mention that the death rate from very simple minor infections back then was very high. A lot of medical issues and deaths could have been avoided if hygiene was better. When you consider what we know today, even by washing your hands can cut down germs by like 90-something%, which would have eliminated most of the things that would have killed you back then. But I digress. The Germans also took biological warfare to a scientific level never before seen. They swapped literal shit in jars, throwing it over a wall and hoping that it worked, for lab-based research. Even though the results varied, the Germans' attempts proved it could be done, and that biological warfare was another covert and destructive tool that could be deployed in war. Germany as a whole underwent a dramatic transition in the post-war years. Johann was expelled from his homeland due to the public and political climate and the rise of the Nazi Party. However, the biological warfare program continues in secret right up until 1933. Anthrax and glanders were the main pathogens researched after the war. When Hitler comes to power, he stops the biological weapons program during World War II. Makes you wonder why. And as I mentioned before, he was a victim of chemical warfare in World War One. So I can see why he doesn't use chemical weapons, but biological weapons is a different thing. And when you consider that the Nazis were so evil in pretty much every other aspect, you think that they would employ any type of warfare that would give them the advantage. But for whatever reason, Nazi Germany doesn't seem to be too interested in biological warfare during World War II. And maybe during the transition years, this came down to Germany being concerned how it would be viewed from the outside. It was a relatively small country. It was surrounded on all sides. While the Nazi Party was rising, it wouldn't have been a very good look if they started to research biological weapons. Maybe other countries around it would have started to get suspicious that they were looking to rearm and start a war, which eventually they did. As we know, it is a bit of an anomaly that they don't seem interested in biological weapons after World War One. Even if Germany's biggest ally does take an interest in biological warfare and takes the research and implementation of these weapons to disturbing new heights, which we'll look at in detail in another episode. But maybe the most obvious and overlooked aspect of biological warfare was the importance of medical science and its knowledge in military campaigns and warfare. Previously, a majority of medical knowledge in wartime went to treating and healing the wounded and dying. Germany uses medical knowledge for nefarious purposes during the war, marking a drastic departure from the role of medicine in the military. This factor, probably more than any other, regarding biological warfare development, is responsible for a great moral predicament. Should medical knowledge be used in the creation and application of weapons for the purposes of infecting humans and/or animals, with the outcome of either making them sick or incapacitated as a result, or worse, resulting in the death of the infected? Can we say this is medical or medicine if it is used to kill or infect? Is there a difference between the two? Is it morally less evil to create a weaker pathogen to use as a weapon in order to make the infected just sick for the purposes of incapacitating soldiers or a civilian population or enemy doctors or nurses or medical personnel? It is a bit of a moral paradox. Is one better than the other? The other side of this moral dilemma is the risk the research and testing of pathogens used in biological warfare have on local populations. One mistake could have a disastrous outcome, causing the infection and/or death of humans and animals in a certain area. Then there is the inevitable cover-up that comes with it, which we'll get into in a future episode. So circling back to this paradoxical equation, if a program like this was to happen right now, wouldn't we hope that there were some ethics or some type of moral supervision overseeing the program? You would hope that doctors or lab personnel had a moral confliction developing and are well informed about the impacts of what they are working on. You hope that the medical personnel weren't a bunch of soulless wackos developing biological weapons out of hatred for another group of people. We'd hope a more ethical person was developing a watered-down version of anthrax rather than a souped-up, even worse version of anthrax. We can only hope that morality and logic prevail. But the past does teach us that during wartime, humans are never this thoughtful or that kind. And that concludes biological warfare in World War I. Even though they weren't widely used or particularly successful, it did pave the way for more nations to invest in biological warfare and research as a weapon and as a tactic. Germany doesn't use biological warfare during World War II, but their biggest ally, Japan, was very interested in this field of study. We'll look at the development and use of biological weapons in World War II on A History of Bioweapons Part 5. And that brings us to the end of the episode. A big thank you to everyone who listened to the end. Part 5 shouldn't be too far away. I hope to get that out before the end of the year, maybe early next year. I'm aiming to have a new episode of Live Communism out every month, so if you haven't listened to that, what are you waiting for? So if you like to support Truth Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. Head on over to the Facebook and Instagram page, give them a follow and a like. Share them around with your friends. You can download your favourite episodes of the Truth Tank on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, Audible, YouTube, Castbox, iHeartRadio, Pandora, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. To your friends, to your family, tell anyone you think might like the show. Help spread the word and get the Truth Tank out there. If you'd like to see the Truth Tank rise through the ranks, you can leave a 5-star rating and review on your preferred podcast player. Every review helps the show grow and get found. So once again, a big thank you to everyone who listened to the end. I'll be back in the next week or two with a brand new episode, but until then, I'm a Tank. This is the truth. Truth to tell.